Good evening, everyone. Late Night Mega here. And tonight I'm just going to do an analysis on some of these drafts and just talk about some things that I've kind of learned. I've done a few more drafts off camera and had some mixed results. Had one result that was pretty successful. And so this is the untapped.gg uh, thing that I've referenced it a few times. I highly recommend looking into something like this. I like this thing because it can give you all kinds of different stats and breakdowns and whatnot. We're going to set this to limited. And what you can do with this, we're just going to set this to call time for the moment, is you can actually go back through. You can see what your win rates are based on the colors that you've played or based on the types of decks you've beat and what you've lost against. It'll also show you like whether you win on the play versus on the draw. And then you can even go into these specific decks. And so let's take a look at the last one that appeared here on the channel. And so I'm trying to learn and grow in the drafting process as well. And so here's some things that I've kind of been finding out, looking at other content and also just some things I've picked up on my own. So the first thing I want to talk about is remember this deck that we just had where we were kind of, if we look at the cards we didn't play, we're kind of torn between playing blue-white or blue-red. And I never made a strong commitment to either of those color pairs. Although I've seen that my more successful drafts or my more successful decks have come when I make a commitment to the colors, probably by, well, you want to commit to one of your colors by the end of your first pack. That should be like a goal. So getting at least a handful of cards in one particular color, and then maybe just picking, a few other good cards, like just the best cards that come in the packs as we get them. And then by the time you get to pack two, somewhere around pick 4 or 5, I think that's going to be my personal goal, is to lock in the second color. Um, of what I'm going to play, and then just focus on drafting those things. Another thing is, and I've said this before, I've just not followed it very well, is don't force archetypes or force colors. So another example is this previous draft, like right here. And I've made this comment even during this draft, is that, green looked pretty open and I was getting past a ton of good green cards. And that's another cool thing about this untapped.gg feature is that it tracks all of your data in all of this in Magic Arena. And you can even like go back through and see what you picked when and what other cards were in the pack. And I could have actually made a pretty decent green-white snow-based deck, maybe splashing black for, what was that saga called? Binding the Old Gods. And there's like a couple of the white-black snow lands I could have picked up. And yeah, I didn't go for that at all. And that is because, okay, yeah, pick 2, I picked the Glimpse. And pick 3, here is where I took Agar, so third pick, and the first pick was a dual land. I'll get back to that subject in a bit. Third pick was Agar, and so then I just kind of locked myself into blue-red and also just kind of forced that. I think going back through this draft, like, maybe I should have still picked Agar as a second or third pick here. But then here, maybe I should have been more open and maybe gone for the Packmate. I don't know. I went through this draft a couple times, and there was just constantly, like, see, we could have Glittering Frost and things like that. And there was just constantly, like, it looked like green was open, especially when we got into pack 2. We can go to pack 2. But anyways, yeah, I'm going to try not forcing a particular archetype, because then, well, you get to draft kind of like this, where, okay, you can force those colors and you'll get enough cards to make a 40 card deck in those colors, but it won't necessarily be the best deck that you could have made out of that draft picking. So my third thing, like, let's take a look at a draft I did, not on camera, but this ended up being very successful, going 6-3, and 6 wins in quick draft gets you enough gems, or more than enough gems, to buy into another draft. And so one of the critical moments, I think, came in pack 3, where the first pick, like, here's this rare. And so I'm going to call this tip rare drafting versus winning the draft. And what I ended up picking was this Demon Bolt here. You can see my... Is this my deck? That's not my deck. That was the deck. Go back to the deck. Okay, here we go. You can see I got 2 Demon Bolts in this. I got 2 Crush the Weaks. I did pick up a Doomskar. I did pick up an Agar. And I ended up just splashing it. Because I also picked up a Glacial Floodplain. And, you know, the splash kind of worked out. But I ended up just building a really solid red-white deck. And I picked this up at some point in the draft, and I just kind of like, well, I'm not seeing a lot of blue cards, or rather, good blue cards to go with, you know, the blue-red Giants theme that I always want to draft. But I saw like a bunch of decent white cards, like Doomskar, God's Whole Guardian, and Bound in Gold, Iron Verdict, and just decided to stick with that and stick with just some really solid red cards. I ended up picking up 3 of these Frenzied Raiders, and then I started looking for some of these Boast mechanics. This ended up being a great combination. But anyways, so pack 3, pick 1. Now, I could have picked this for my collection. I don't know, maybe I'd build a standard deck at some point focused on elves. This seems like a good and decent elf guy. Maybe constructed playable. Another good example to bring up here would be like the dual lands. You know, you want to collect those for constructed play. But at what cost? And so here's how I started to think of it, is looking at sort of the math of things. And what I mean by that is, if I didn't take this second Demon Bolt, would I have gotten 6 wins? Maybe, but probably not, if I'm being honest. I'd still have a deck of 40 cards. They'd still all be in the same colors, but I don't think the deck would be as good as what it turned out to be. And so the math is this. I can win this draft and get 6 or 7 wins, and that gives you enough gems to get an entry fee, basically for free, into the next draft. And for entering that draft, you'll get to open, you know, 3 packs, draft another deck out of that, and get 1 guaranteed prize pack, at least. Or more, depending on, you know, which other drafting format you're playing. Premier Draft, the prizes, the packs you win are a bit higher in quantity as you go up in wins. But regardless, the concept is still the same. And it's, do I want to go for the winning the draft and getting basically a free entry to another draft, or do I want to pick up 1 more guaranteed rare right here, right now? You could say, well, you'll get a pack for winning this draft. Yes, the current draft that you're in, yes, you are guaranteed at least 1 pack. But as soon as you press the button and pay the entry fee, you're guaranteed that 1 prize pack. Whereas this is kind of forward-looking to, and because you can't compare this with a prize pack that you're already guaranteed to get. So instead, I'm comparing this to a future prize pack of the next draft. So I could either pick up this rare and probably not go 6-3 and not get free entry to the next draft, or I could forgo this rare, pick up the card that's best for my deck, which is another removal spell, and have a much better chance at getting 6 or 7 wins. And that will give me another free prize pack in the future from a future draft. And so that's kind of the way I'm going to look at things to maybe try and restrain myself from rare drafting and instead just focus on making the best draft deck possible. Now, when it comes to mythic rares, since those are, well, mythic, I might still just snap those up as we go. Because it would be harder to get a play set of the mythics. If I go back to the main profile, yeah, you can see like your rare and your mythic rare collection by the percentages. And so yeah, maybe still pick up the mythics and you can get away with that. So yeah. So the next thing I wanted to look at, was what went well in all of these decks. And there was one trend that really stood out to me in any draft deck I had where I won 6 or 7 games, and it came in the 2-drop slot, specifically creatures that cost 2 mana or less. And I noticed that I had exactly 5 creatures that cost 2 mana or less. It happened in this black-red deck. 1 Fearless Pup, 2 Berserkers, and 2 of these Disciples. And when I put this deck together, this black-red deck, I was not expecting to get 7 wins with it. I just wasn't. I wasn't really expecting to get 6 wins with that red-white deck that I was just showing you. Honestly, a lot of the decks that I end up getting 6 or 7 wins with are decks that I don't feel super confident about when I first go into the first games with it. But here we have the same exact pattern. 1 Fearless Pup, 1 Axegard Cavalry, and 3 of these Frenzied Raiders. That is 5 creatures that cost exactly 2 mana or less. And I'm going to go over to the Crimson Vow drafts. I'll show you the 6 and 7 wins I got there, and you'll see the same exact pattern. Now, of course, there's still a whole rest of the deck to build. You want to fill out your 3-drop slot as well. But another thing that I noticed I was doing was, we've all talked about, or we've all seen, how many 2-drops. We've seen the overall mana curve, but I don't see a lot of advice out there, or at least I haven't come across much, that talks about how many creatures you should have at each mana cost. Okay, you ask for any drafting advice, you get, okay, well, you want 17 lands, you want roughly 15 to 18 creatures, and then the remainder being non-creatures, and then you want this mana curve of 5 to 8 2-drops, and so on and so forth. But that's just 2-drops. And so I've been operating under the assumption that, well, it could just be anything and it doesn't matter. But what I'm finding is that's not really the case, because I'm having the most success when I have exactly 5 creatures that cost 2 mana or less. And so a lot of things, one of the traps I've been falling into is using these foretell cards. You can foretell a card on turn 2, and that's a completely valid play. However, I should not be using that, you should not be using that as a way to skimp on running creatures in these 2-drop slots. It's just, I'm looking for consistent results. And when I started comparing all this, because this is a great tool to compare all your drafts and your decks and how well everything went, or didn't go. That is the thing that just immediately stood out to me was the amount of creatures in this 2-drop slot. There was one deck I tried here. You know, when I played that the 5-color bombs deck that well, we kind of bombed with. One of the decks we lost to was like a really go wide white red aggro, and so I thought I would try and do that in one draft. And look at all these 2-drops I have here. 2-drop creatures. I actually had 3 of these guys. They were not impressive. And yeah, I went 0 and 3 because these 2-drops did get outclassed. Uh, this guy just got outclassed by like basically everything. But that's more of an analysis on that card. I'll save that for another time. And this deck just didn't really get off the ground. It didn't perform like the aggro deck that ran me over. So having more than that amount of 2-mana creatures just doesn't seem better. Again, we can go check this deck from the just the last video. We've got 2 Fearless Pups and 1 Axguard Cavalry as the 2-drop creatures. We're missing some of those. And as a result, the deck can tend to struggle in those early turns when it comes to developing board presence. And then the 3-drop slot, doesn't get a whole lot better than that. There's a few things here we could do. This could be a turn 3 play if you foretell it on turn 2. But again, if you're foretelling this on turn 2, you're not playing a 2-drop creature because, well, we just didn't have enough. And so I think that's one of the reasons that deck kind of faltered. Let's look at our 5-color bombs deck. We actually had 4 2-drop creatures. We had plenty of other things to do at 2 mana, which is not bad. You want to have more than just 5 creatures at 2 mana. But I think specifically the sweet spot is 5 creatures at 2 mana, or another alternative I found in a couple cases is 4 creatures that cost 2 mana and at least 1 or 2 cheap removal spells. And when I say cheap removal spells, I mean removal that costs 1 or 2 mana. So this Iron Verdict would not count towards that, but what could count would be like Frostbite, getting a couple Frostbites, and then 4 creatures. So that way you can kind of trade your cheap removal for your opponent's cheap creature, and then get into your turn 3 and 4 plays without feeling so far behind. Because one thing I tend to do is I go, oh, these 4-mana cards, they're really powerful, they're pretty cool, they're more towards the top end, and I'll tend to scoop up a lot of 4-mana cards. Thinking that would be good. But if you're skipping your turn 2 and turn 3, and the first thing you're really playing in a game is these 4-mana cards, it can oftentimes feel like you're trying to fight from behind and catch up, rather than having a good curve, and not just a good curve of cards in general, but a good curve in creatures specifically. So that way your 4-drops end up adding to your board rather than trying to play catch up, and you're just able to develop a consistent board state throughout your games. So I said, where we go? So I said let's check on some Crimson Vow drafts, and we're gonna see mostly the same sort of trend. This deck is actually the exception, but this red-white deck. This was a deck that, I went into the draft not expecting or not trying to force any specific colors. And let's take a look at what we have. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 creatures. This is one of the examples of 4 creatures. But I also have Piercing Light and Abrade. So there's the 4 creature and 2 removal examples. I got 7 wins with this deck. And you can also see that the 3-drop slot is filled out pretty nicely with a good amount of creatures. And then there's just a few things at the 5-drop slot. 3 creatures and 1 removal. and a few things, just three things at the 4-drop slot. And I was not feeling confident at all about this deck when I first put it together and clicked on, hey, let's start playing games, game one, and see what happens. And I ended up going 7-2 with the deck. This deck here, this was a fun deck. So this deck ended up, here's two Storm Chaser Drake, Packsong Pup, and two of these spiders. Exactly 5 2-drops. The 3-drop slot is a bit lacking, but you notice they're both ramp type cards, and then we also have the Hive Heart Shaman that can also help get us lands. And then this one I just kind of went crazy in here. These Flourishing Hunters, many of the games I won was just by chaining like 2 or 3 of these guys together in a Bramble Worm, because they would just gain me so much life, they'd make up for all the life I lost in the earlier turns where I didn't have a lot of 3-drops and didn't have necessarily as much going on. And, well, this deck worked. They worked pretty dang well. I was very surprised at how things went. But again, the 2-drop slot, that's like where it's at. Let's go down to my first Crimson Vow draft here, where I drafted green-white. Hopeful Initiate, Drogskull Infantry, Trainee, Disciple, and Sporeback Wolf. Exactly 5 creatures that are 2 mana or less, and I went 6 and 3. And this also had a good amount of stuff going on at the 3-drop slot. Well, yeah, a decent amount of stuff going on at the 3-drop slot. Maybe got a little bit heavy on the 4-drops, as I tend to do. Maybe this should have been another 3-drop, probably. So yeah, that's like one of my biggest tips. And, just another proof of concept here, this white-black deck, where I start getting like a lot of life gain stuff, I have, look at all these 2-drops that I have. I went 3 and 3 with it, and I'm not saying that any of these specific 2-drops are bad cards. I'm just saying I had too many of them. And it was kind of evident as I was playing the games. Yeah, I drafted 3 Heroes Downfall in this. It was kind of nuts. But I didn't have a lot of stuff at the top end. I had a few things, but probably not enough. Some of these 2-drops should have been more maybe 4 and 5-drops or 3-drops even, because I was kind of lacking in some of those as far as the creature count. But yeah, this deck ended up being super grindy. Like, I could hold off my opponent's offense, but when they started playing like a whole bunch of 3 toughness creatures, like, it was really hard to get through 3 toughness things with this deck. It was also hard for my opponent to attack in as well. And I think this was a deck where like every game, almost every game I played with this, like both players got down to less than 10 cards in their deck before someone either won or lost. And it was kind of ridiculous, kind of really grindy. And I think part of that reason is because I had so many 2-drops and not enough of a good creature curve. So it is about the mana curve, but it's also about the creature curve, which is what I'm learning and what I want to take away. This deck is slightly an anomaly. As you can see, we have the Ragged Recluse. I realized like really late into the draft, like I needed more 2-drop creatures. That's when I ended up picking up this because, there wasn't another 2-drop creature in that particular pack. And I'm like, I really need more at the 2-drop slot. So yeah, I only had technically 2 creatures. There was a couple times I played this on turn 2, but I did have 2 cheap removal spells, which kind of made up for it. But I do not recommend this type of ratio, this 3-2. Make it at least 4-2, 4 creatures and 2 cheap removal spells, or better yet, 5 cheap creatures. This deck did struggle in the early games stabilizing, but it had a good amount of removal, good amount of threats. and was able to kind of stabilize with these scavengers were a huge help. But I think if I was going to rebuild this deck, I'd probably take out maybe one of the 4 drops and get something else cheaper in here. But this deck did go 7-1. You can see it had a lot of recursion between Dollhouse, Edgar's Awakening, and Blood Fountain. And there's a lot of blood token synergies in the deck as well. Falcon Wrath Forebearer. A lot of things that just produced or made blood tokens. So it made the deck pretty consistent. And then I have, this bomb rare that I would just return to the field 2 or 3 times, and eventually it would stick and it would win. And that's how I won most of the games with this. Is just the longer the game went on, the more consistent this deck was, and the more kind of unstoppable it became with all its recursion and Helena and Elena. So yeah, that was that deck. Little bit of anomaly from the pattern I've been discussing here with the 2-mana creatures, but every other deck that won 6 or 7 matches had either 5 solid 2-drop creatures or 4 2-drop creatures and at least 2 cheap removal. And so that is something I'm going to try going forward. Another thing I'm going to try going forward, which I backed up too far. Another thing I tried in the last draft I did, go back to the Kaldheim draft, is I was building this deck as I went along in the draft. So instead of just getting all the cards of all the colors that I'm playing together and then being like, okay, well, let's try and cut this down. And I'm looking at 45 to 52 cards and being like, oh my gosh, how am I going to cut this down to 40? Instead, just kind of cut as you go along. And so when I'm drafting Snowlands, I'll draft them if they're relevant, and I'll just throw them immediately in the sideboard, even if they are in the colors I need. Because the goal is 23 cards, right? And you can have like a little, it'll have the counter in the corner as you're drafting of how many cards are currently in your deck. And so I don't want to add lands to that count. And I can just watch that counter and be like, okay, well, I'm at 18 cards. This is where I'm at in the draft. I need to pick up 5 more cards. Okay, I'm at 23 cards. Now I can have the mentality of, if I pick another card in my colors, I need to remove something immediately from the current deck or just not play the card I'm picking. And you can kind of figure that out as you go along. That way, because I don't know about you guys, but I get overwhelmed when I get to the end and I have like 45 or more cards, and I'm like, I need to figure out how to cut this down to 40. And that's really tough for me. But I think going along and doing what I did here and just making cuts as I go and going, do I really need to play this? And then this can also be a guide for like going back to the rare drafting. If you see cards in your colors that you're not going to play, but there's like another rare in the set, like it's a pick 5 or 6 dual land or whatever the case may be, then maybe you can rare draft. If it's a card that you're not going to play in your deck, that there's nothing else in that pack that you would play. And this could also be a better way to just kind of keep an eye on, okay, I have 20 cards in the deck right now, and I only have 4 of the 2-mana or less creatures, so I need to find another one of those, rather than having a draft where I just start snapping up everything that looks good or has a quote-unquote good rating. This card has a quote-unquote good rating, is rating like a 3.0 or a 3.5 or something. I think that's ridiculously high for this card. Super disappointed. But that's a rant for another day. But instead of just being like, oh, well, this card is rated 3, so I'm going to take it, even though I already have a full 2-drop slot, Well, you don't really know if you have. Well, you might know, um, but it's easier to tell like what's actually in your deck if you keep your uh, total and just throw cards you're not playing into the sideboard. And then when I get to the end, I only had like 41 or 42 cards, and I only had to make one or two cuts, and that wasn't difficult at all. And then I ended up going 6-3. So yeah, those are some of the lessons I've learned about draft recently, and yeah, so I appreciate you guys. Hopefully, you guys got something out of this. I mean, if nothing else, look into get yourself this Untapped.gg tool. It's completely free. I mean, there's like premium content you can have, but I have not paid for this. I'm not going to pay for this. I'm not sponsored by them. That would be It'd be cool if I was. But oh yeah, and a lesson from this draft, the first one I showed on the channel was you know, don't splash a double black card. And again, don't force a particular color combination. So yeah, with all this advice uh, intact or learned, I'm going to try applying that to some more drafts, and we'll see how it goes. So I'll see you guys next time.